So here he is now, my favorite historian, Kenneth C Davis. Great to see you, my friend. You got a haircut. You look handsome. We're talking on Zoom. I'll post this video. Thank you for joining me for a very special July 4th episode.
Good morning, Pete. Glad to be with you on this July 3rd. I did get a haircut. I feel human again. It had been a long time. I'm starting to feel like, bear with furniture here in my cave in Manhattan. But I did go out the other day, second day that the barbershops were open. So I was pursuing happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well played.
The pursuit of the barbershop. It's been, it's been an extraordinary time for all of us. And so this 4th of July is certainly different from any other.
I want to ask you about that, because for the past 30 years, since your first book, Don't Know Much About History, was published in 1990, you have been highlighting the stories our school books left out about our Independence Day and so many other very important stories and parts of our history. But why does this year seem different? How do we explain that?
Well, first of all, obviously, the pandemic towers over everything right now that we are thinking, doing, living, breathing. And so the notion that we are not going to the family picnic, the barbecue, that we're not going to be 1 million people standing on the East River to watch the Macy's fireworks makes it different. And we are all just trying to figure out how we are supposed to pursue life, liberty, and happiness right now. But that's almost secondary to what else has happened in the country. And that's this great reckoning that we are living with right now, the great reckoning that has come about in the wake of the murders of so many Black men and women at the hands of police, this revival and extraordinary explosion of Black Lives Matter and the protests it has created across the country, that has led to something I really didn't anticipate seeing so quickly after so long: the eradication and the erasure of these symbols of slavery in our history. They have been so completely tied to the American past that I'm astonished to see not only the statues come down, but last week, as you probably know, Princeton University announced that they were taking Woodrow Wilson's name off an institute at the university. The man was the president of Princeton University, as well as president of the United States, and they are taking his name off a building because of his racism. So this is an extraordinary moment of reckoning for American history, for Americans in our time. As you said, I've been writing about this for 30 years. Don't Know Much About History came out in 1990. At the time I wrote the book, I asked this question. The book is a series of questions and answers. How do these men who write these words, all men are created equal and are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how do these men go back to plantations utterly dependent upon enslavement? It is the great contradiction at the heart of American history. We haven't talked about it. We haven't taught it. It's the contradiction that a nation conceived in liberty, as Lincoln put it, was also born in shackles. And until we really confront that truth and teach that truth and talk about that truth, as Americans, we are not going to get past this moment. But that moment has clearly arrived. And that's why this 4th of July is different from any other that I can remember.
The reason you're my favorite historian, and I say that all the time, but I mean it, is because you always take into consideration the history of minorities and historically discriminated against groups, mainly women and Black folks, and you include them in all of your books. Of course, you wrote a book about the Civil War, Don't Know Much About the Civil War, and America's hidden history, and don't know much about the American presidents. And of course, the aforementioned Don't Know Much About History. It's always included in there. You could be a professor of America's racist history easily. I mean, and that's why it's so important that today we talk about July 4th and everything else, because there's so much in, inequity within our history. But real quick, what was wrong with poor Woodrow Wilson? What did he do wrong besides showing Birth of a Nation in the White House?
Well, Woodrow Wilson was, first of all, a little bit of presidential trivia, the last president born into a slaveholding household.
Huh.
Many people think of Woodrow Wilson as this kind of progressive guy, governor of New Jersey, the leader of Princeton University for a time, an academic, a very, very established historian in his own right, a PhD, a very cerebral kind of man who had also then led the country through World War I and was hailed as a great peacemaker because he wanted to create this League of Nations and try and create peace out of the disaster of World War I. But that concealed the aspect of his presidency until recently that was not widely explored, which is that he resegregated the federal workforce.
Resegregated it. It was integrated, and he then divided it again?
That's correct.
Oh, God.
The federal government had slowly begun to be integrated over, the 50 years previous that the Civil War had ended, so that African Americans were able at last to get jobs in the federal government. They began to move up in the federal government. They worked in the patent office and other places. And this was a slow incremental change, of course, in the federal government. In coming into the White House, Wilson renounced that. It was also very, very opposed to Bolshevism and socialism, and some of the first Red Scares in American history really begin under Woodrow Wilson. So he had this for a long time veneer of progressivism that concealed his racism and his repression of dissent. He was responsible, for instance, for making sure that Eugene V. Debs, a socialist who ran for president, went to jail, ostensibly for opposing the draft during World War I.
Really?
So Wilson has been reappraised. It's interesting, though, that 5 years ago, Princeton was asked to vote on this question of taking his name off a building, and they decided not to. But that's why I say this moment is so different.
Right. Yeah. Just 5 years ago, things were still not where they are at now. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president. He was in office from 1911 to 1913. I had to look it up. You, of course, did not. He was also the 34th governor of New Jersey. So he was governor after being president? No, before he was president, right?
No, he was elected in 1912. So he was in office from 1912, the elected president, 1912.
Got it.
He defeats a very strange election, and we're getting off topic here a little bit, but that's what we do. He was elected in this very extraordinary election in which Theodore Roosevelt, the former Republican president, ran as an independent on the so-called Bull Moose Party, and William Howard Taft, who was the incumbent Republican president, was also running as a Republican. And the two of them really divide the Republican vote in a lot of states. And so Wilson is able to win a very substantial electoral college victory, but he mostly does it by winning a plurality of states which had once gone Republican, including New York and Ohio and Illinois, the land of Lincoln. So Wilson kind of comes into the office because two Republicans cannibalize each other. And so he's in office from 1912 right through the war. He runs for re-election in 1916 on a peace platform. It says he kept us out of war. And right after his inauguration in 1917 for the second term, America declares war on Germany and we go to war. And this is, of course, the story I tell in More Deadly Than War, my book about World War I and the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
Wilson is the president during that pandemic in our history. and
Let's.
spectacularly ineffective at dealing with a pandemic. But it was a
Mm,
very different country then.
I thought it was weird when he suggested Americans should inject bleach into their veins.
That was not his suggestion.
Oh,
He actually didn't make any suggestions
oh,
about what Americans should do, because he was really only focused on winning the war and making sure that the war was paid for. So we didn't get medical advice from President Woodrow Wilson.
let me get back to the 4th of July and Independence Day, which is what we plan to talk about today. There's so much to discuss with you. Let's what did Congress leave out of the Declaration of Independence that had to do with slavery, sir?
Well, that's the real point here. Once again, we come back to this issue of slavery. As much as we want to talk about how magnificent this document is, we have to talk about what it says and what it doesn't say. Jefferson wrote a very angry denunciation of slavery, in which he blamed the King of England, King George III, for the slave trade and also for preventing America from stopping it. This was utter nonsense, and a reminder that the Jefferson's magnificent document was also propaganda. The long list of charges against King George III included, just some over-the-top kind of language. This particular reference to slavery was specifically deleted by the Congress, which debated the Declaration of Independence for several days before it was actually adopted on July 4th. Jefferson wasn't happy with any of the changes that the Congress had made, but he specifically singled this one out as because he called slavery the execrable commerce, and that's a very fancy word that means shitty. So here he is complaining about slavery, putting it into this document which talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. And yet he too, of course, is going back to a Monticello entirely dependent upon enslaved labor. And of course, the more intimate aspect of slavery in his own life, his eventual relationship with Sally Hemings, the young enslaved woman who was the half-sister of Jefferson's Jefferson's wife, Martha, who had died. Sally Hemings is her half-sister. Most people may have heard of Sally Hemings, but they don't know that aspect of it. She was also 30. She was also 30 years younger than he was.
Oh, wow. I don't feel like that was depicted in Lincoln by who played those roles. Anyway, the age difference, I never knew that.
Yes, she was 14 years old. It's a rather extraordinary story also. And that's
I have it wrong about Lincoln. That wasn't Jefferson.
History is so remarkable. People who say, oh, it's boring, dates, battles, and speeches, haven't read a word of it, because if you treat it as a human story, it's endlessly fascinating, far richer than many novels. But Sally,
which is what you do in your books, don'tknowmuch.com. Go get them all. History was never boring to me, but it was never as exciting as when I read Don't Know Much About History for that first summer. I remember reading it. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So Jefferson is in France. This is after independence. He's in France as the minister to France before the Constitution. And Sally Hemings is 14 years old, about 14 years old, because we don't know exactly what year she was born. And she accompanies Jefferson's 9-year-old daughter on an cross-Atlantic voyage, a transatlantic voyage. Imagine putting a 9-year-old on a ship with a 14-year-old to take care of her. And so Sally...
We're going to let our kids go to the mall these days.
Exactly. Sally eventually arrives in Paris with Jefferson's daughter, and this is certainly where I hate to use the word relationship, but that's what it was. It's a relationship, not necessarily of her choosing, obviously. She's an enslaved teenager. She returns from Paris, apparently pregnant. And that child was not born. We don't really know what happened, whether it was a stillbirth or a miscarriage. So this is the picture that
Wow.
we have to still keep in mind of Thomas Jefferson when we have this. So yes, he was 30 years her senior. Monticello has recently, by the way, discovered the room in the house which she used. It had been buried away, covered over, and it was adjacent to Jefferson's bedroom. So just
Just
more.
to be clear, he was a 44-year-old man in a relationship with a 14-year-old woman.
That's essentially what
Yeah.
it comes down
I'm
to.
44. My daughter is 15, for the record, and that's just a wild thing. And I never knew that age difference, and it's an important age difference. All right, so I think I might have just interrupted you, but I want to ask you another question about the Declaration of Independence.
But we were talking about the slavery piece that was taken out of the Declaration.
Yes,
Jefferson
sorry.
later says this was taken out in deference to the men who owned slaves, as well as those who were making a great deal of money transporting them. And this is, of course, a reminder that of the 56 men who ultimately signed the Declaration of Independence, my count is that 40 or 41 of them were enslavers. So the vast majority. Every
Wow.
state in the new United States of America permitted slavery. This was not a function of only the Deep South, the future Confederacy. This was a piece of America. And of course, that's 1776. 11 years later, it is then cemented into the Constitution with a number through a number of pieces of the Constitution, especially the compromise that will count the enslaved as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining the population in the census. So this is why slavery is central and essential to our history, central to our government, central to the power of these men. So you think of, for instance, a place like Rhode Island, nice little Rhode Island right up there. It was one of the major centers of slave trading in colonial and then early the early republic, the early United States of America. Brown University is founded by a group of men who are essentially enslavers. The Brown brothers ran slaves. One of their sea captains was a man named Esek Hopkins. His brother, William Hopkins, was a signer of the Declaration. Brown University actually went through a very, very rigorous examination of its relationship to slavery a few years ago. And it's a very, very interesting, revealing document. I've posted it a couple of times on my Twitter account. It's in one of my blogs right now about the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, but really instructive to see how the wealth of this country, and this is a perfect example of it, was really founded upon slavery in so many ways. It wasn't just a sideshow, in other words, to American history. It was a central act in this drama.
I'm so glad we're focusing on it. We learned a completely different history growing up, and some people might be listening and saying, why are you so focused on the role of Black Americans during this time? And it's because, well, we never learned about this stuff. If you already knew about this stuff, well, then I apologize. I didn't, and it's really important, and Ken has documented it in his books and his blog and his articles. So I was watching one of the greatest films of all time, starring one of the greatest Americans of all time, Mel Gibson, and The Patriot. I'm being sarcastic about both Mel Gibson and it being a great film. I'm sure you have strong opinions on that film. I don't want to discuss it per se, but in the final battle scene, which I don't remember where it was or what battle that was, there is a Black soldier who is fighting on the side of the Patriots, the revolutionaries, what do they call themselves? And there's this weird poignant scene where, the white soldier looks at the Black soldier and they kind of like, we're buddies. I forget what they say. But my question to you is, what role did Black soldiers play in the revolution? And Did George Washington include them? Did he recruit black soldiers? What was his role?
Well, let me start with the beginning and say that the first blood shed by an American in what eventually becomes the American Revolution, in a way, is that of a man named Crispus Attucks, who's killed at the Boston Massacre, which begins is one of the long steps in a long road to eventual revolution. Uh, African Americans fought in every engagement in the American Revolution, including Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill.
Huh.
When George Washington takes command of the army, which is in 1775, June of 1775, a full year before independence is declared, he goes off to Boston, actually Cambridge, to take command of the army. And he immediately, by the way, accompanied by his loyal manservant, William Lee, who was with George Washington every day of the American Revolution.
Manservant.
Loyal manservant.
That was what they actually called them?
Well, that's what Washington called him, and that's how he refers to him when he frees him in his will, which William Lee is the only person Washington actually frees in his will. So Washington goes off and he sees black men with guns and he says, we're not having this. As the war went along, he was so desperate for manpower, for warm bodies, that he eventually relents. And of course, this is all running through, for those who have seen Hamilton, this runs through the whole Hamilton story, the story of Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette and a young guy named John Lawrence, who really vigorously wanted to bring African-American soldiers into the fight for freedom. But you have descriptions of the Revolutionary Army, Washington's Continental Army, where a Frenchman looks at them and says he can't believe that this bedraggled, shoeless group of teenagers and black men is fighting this war. So the numbers are a little bit unclear, but certainly African Americans served throughout the American Revolution. They were there at the beginning at Lexington and Concord. They were there at Yorktown in 1781, a very notable group called the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. This was actually a group that was formed because every state, even though there wasn't a national draft during the American Revolution, every state still had a quota that it was supposed to meet. And they met their quotas through conscription, in other words, a draft.
Right.
They couldn't get enough people in Rhode Island, white people, to fight. So they offered African Americans their freedom if they would join the army, and many of them happily did. And they would then compensate the owners for these people who would be emancipated. Washington balked at this a little bit, but realized he had to go along with it. Otherwise, he just wasn't going to have enough cannon fodder. So this is, a piece of the story, another piece of the story that the history books, certainly of my childhood, left out. And so that's why, I don't say that this is African-American history. This is not Black history that we tell once a month. This is American history.
Right.
And the fact that so many people are unaware of it, the fact that I meet somebody in an airport and tell them I've written a book about American presidents who owned slaves, and they say, which presidents? That still is news to people, that 4 of the first 5 and 5 of the first 7 American presidents were slaveholders. Slavery represented political power in the 19th century in America because of that 3/5 compromise I mentioned before. It made Virginia the largest state. What does that mean? It means that Virginia had the most seats in Congress and the most electors. So 4 of the first 5 presidents are Virginia slaveholders. This was the essence of the political argument in the first half of the 19th century over slavery. It wasn't a moral issue. It was the political and financial issue for most Americans, and certainly most American politicians. And that's just the story that we're not able to teach very well.
Who was Frederick Douglass, and why did he sit out July 4th? Why did he take a knee instead of celebrating July 4th?
Frederick Douglass was, of course, born enslaved in Maryland and eventually escapes, a rather extraordinary story, escapes and becomes perhaps the most famous African-American man of the 19th century, probably without question, the most famous African-American man of the 19th century, known worldwide. He's an orator, he's a writer, he is a newspaper publisher, totally dedicated to the cause of abolition. In 1852, I think it was, he is living and writing and publishing in Rochester, New York, and he's asked to give a 4th of July speech. Everyone wants to come and hear the wonderful orator, Frederick Douglass, speak about the glorious 4th of July.
Did everybody see him as a wonderful orator, as a wonderful man? Did people respect his intellect, or was there, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Many did, and certainly others wanted to assassinate him if they could. And he actually goes to London, to England at a certain point, because there is a price on his head.
Wow,
And there are threats against his life. So he's speaking on, I think it's 1852 in Rochester, and Millard Fillmore, the president, is in the audience. And rather than give a nice speech about how wonderful the 4th of July is, he says, what to the slave is the 4th of July? And he says, there's no nation on earth that is guilty of more bloody crimes than the United States of America. So it was well beyond take a knee. It was really take this. And it shocked people of the time, but he was essentially saying, how can you people celebrate these ideals of liberty and freedom and equality while 4 million people are in chains? And that essentially was the great contradiction of American history to that point in a nutshell. And we're still dealing with that contradiction in the deep, deep racial divide in this country.
No doubt about it. That's a really important part about July 4th and an event that occurred on July 4th. And this is, of course, what year? Because that he made that speech, you just said it.
I think it was 1852.
Yeah, and of course, the Civil War.
Might be off a little bit there, but it's around there. It's the time leading up, of course, to the American Civil War, and of course, the time when the debate over abolition was really extremely heated in this country. Again, people like Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison or other abolitionists were still pretty much considered a radical fringe group. Most of the people who were opposed to slavery on a political basis were more opposed to it for political reasons. And Abraham Lincoln eventually would become one of those people when the Republican Party is eventually formed. The Republican Party was willing, and Abraham Lincoln were willing to say, slavery is legal, it's in the Constitution, it can exist where it exists, we'd like to see it end eventually, but we just don't want it to expand any further into the new territory, enormous new territory that was being opened up in the American West in the 1840s and 50s. And that was the real political fight of the day. Not abolition of slavery, just the end of the expansion of slavery. And of course, to the states in which there was slavery, they wanted to keep expanding it further and further for financial reasons, as well as every new state that came in as a slave state meant 2 more senators who were from the slave states, well as another vote in Congress. And that meant 3 more electoral votes. So this was a really powerful part of the American political system. And even people who recognize that slavery was important and an issue often think it's because of the moral issue, but the moral issue was really well down the line for most American politicians, and including the Republican Party.
Talking to the great Kenneth C Davis. Don'tknowmuch.com is his website. You've got to order all of his books if you haven't already. We're talking about the history of America's independence, specifically July 4th. And I really don't know much about the role of the French in the revolution. Why did the French join the American revolutionaries and George Washington's army? And specifically, who was Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette? And what did he think about slavery? How did I do, by the way, with that pronunciation?
I'm not going to go near your Pepe Le Pew there. Let me take the first part first. The French had a king. The king certainly wasn't very concerned with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The King of France. He certainly wasn't in line with the idea that we should get rid of monarchs. But his rationale, his only rationale, was the fact that France and England were at war, as they had been and would continue to be for many, many years. So this was more of like European geopolitical superpower argument than anything over ideology. So the French eventually do support the American rebels, mostly because they want to weaken the British as they are fighting them for control over other colonial spaces. And of course, the French would eventually have a large piece of the United States of America. They had lost a significant piece of North America a few years earlier to the British after the French and Indian War in 1763. Canada goes from France to Great Britain. So there were, superpower politics there. For Monsieur Lafayette, this young 19-year-old, very wealthy young aristocrat, he was one of the true, I would say, idealists of the day. And I think he was extremely admired in this country for a very, very long time. It kind of faded into, being just one more old white guy in a painting. But he really came to the United States and volunteered his services to Washington and paid for a ship and paid to bring himself over because he believed in the cause. And so he's really, truly one of the idealists of the moment who represented these Enlightenment ideals. He himself would eventually emancipate the enslaved people that he had inherited. He had a plantation in what is South America. He frees those people, starts to educate them and pay them for their labor instead. Later on offers Washington the same deal. He says, I'll give you an island somewhere and you can free these people. Washington says, I'll have my lawyers get back to you on that.
Oh my goodness, really? Wow. Oh, that's so interesting that he was given this kind of an out to free his slaves, and he basically sounds like he dismissed it.
Washington, like many of these other founding fathers, eventually gets conflicted about this. And this is important to realize because even today you hear people say, well, they were men of their times. They were men of their times, certainly, and they had grown up completely surrounded by the world of slavery. It put the food on their backs, it put the food on their table, the clothes on their backs. It enriched them. It was the source of their wealth. It was also their capital was completely invested in this human property. I hate to use the words, but that's what it was, certainly in their eyes. So they were utterly dependent upon it, but Washington began to see the contradiction. And he understood it. And even in 1786, he starts to write to people and say, no one wishes more than I do to see a plan for abolition. Yet, at the height of his power and his prestige and his popularity as president, he really does nothing to help bring about that end. In fact, he does things that are the opposite of it, like signing the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793. So this is a really complicated story, Pete, and I don't want to, reduce it to simplistic notions. It was very complicated by politics. It was complicated by
Yeah,
power and money. It wasn't just this pure idealism, even though we celebrate on the 4th of July a very, very important set of ideals that
I
have.
think that's important that you mentioned how complicated it is, how much nuance there is. And that's why I think, again, going back to your point about why history is fascinating, because it's not simple, it's not binary the way that today's media and politicians want to make things. Let me ask you one final question about the document itself, Ken. The Declaration of Independence. What was new or different about it? It would seem that the founding fathers, the architects of the writers, the signers of the Constitution, based their ideas and ideology a lot on Europe and other civilizations and other governments before them. But what was new? What was different? What was, if I dare say, radical about the Declaration of Independence?
Um, First, just a piece of fun trivia, since today is the 3rd of July.
Do you
Yes.
want to ask me this as a question so I can be embarrassed by not knowing it publicly?
No, no, I'll just
Okay.
tell you this.
All
This
right.
is fun. Yesterday was the 2nd of July. That was the day that John Adams thought we would celebrate the nation's birthday, because Congress actually votes for a resolution of independence on July 2nd. Adam goes home that night, writes this beautiful flowery letter to his lovely wife, Abigail, back in Massachusetts, talking about how this will be the day that we'll celebrate with bonfires and parades and illuminations, kind of like fireworks. And he really thought that this would be the great celebration. Of course, it's the 4th of July, which we will celebrate tomorrow, that becomes the nation's birthday, because it is the day on which this document is adopted by the Congress, not signed, but adopted by vote unanimously by the 13 United States of America. The first time that that phrase is used in a document, by the way, is on the Declaration of Independence. It was radical because we kind
July
of.
4th, by the way, his birthday, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's, right?
No, not their birthdays. It was the day they died.
I'm going
John
to edit that
Adams.
out. I'm not going to.
Okay.
I'm not going to.
We'll
Wow. Okay. My bad. Yeah, they died on the same day, like hours apart. That's what it
on
was.
the
Adams.
50th anniversary of the adoption of the
Got it.
Declaration.
I'm sorry. I got it wrong, but I'm glad to have gotten it right now. Go ahead.
So the significance of this document, we might read the first few paragraphs, still the preamble, and it's kind of become cliched. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when Jefferson is writing these words, they were, in the atmosphere, in the ether at the time, but they were still very radical ideas. The notion that all men are created equal was not a widely accepted notion. This was after centuries of most men and women being feudal serfs, or completely loyal to a king or a pope. So this was essentially a radical idea that comes out of the European Enlightenment, where the human beings are being elevated and the divine right of kings is being dismissed. The second part is that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson actually borrows that phrase from several others who had written life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Now, he was looking for something a little bit bigger. Also, property did convey the idea of slavery. So he wanted to find something, I believe it was Franklin who suggests happiness to him. A reminder that Jefferson gets some help in this drafting.
Right.
But finally, and again, that's a new idea then, that people are entitled to this, are born with this inherent right. And finally, he talks about the fact that a government must rule with the consent of the governed. Again, this was written at a time when people for centuries had either been ruled by kings or churches, where no one was asked their consent. So this was also a very, very significant turning point, not just in American history, but world history. So I think that, we can be skeptical, we can be even cynical to some degree about these founding fathers and what they accomplished, but it was an extraordinary moment in human history, clearly a tipping point of sorts in human history. And for that, I think we can celebrate this day, even while acknowledging the inherent contradictions that were true 244 years ago.
I always learn so much when I read your work. And of course, I am always honored to be able to ask you questions and be in conversation with you. You are my favorite historian. Don'tknowmuch.com. Go get his books. Today would be a great day to buy them. And this next week would be a great week to read them. Thank you, as always, Kenneth C Davis, for joining me.
Thank you, Pete. Now go pursue happiness.
On to it.